The sooner we get that house, the better. Those were the words that changed everything I thought I knew about my family. At the time, I was standing just outside my son's dining room, holding a bowl of homemade mashed potatoes, preparing to walk back to the table with a smile on my face. For a moment, I froze. I recognized my daughter-in-law Vanessa's voice immediately. What stopped me wasn't just what she said. It was the silence that followed. A long silence. The kind of silence that should have been filled with disagreement. The kind of silence a loving son should have broken immediately. But Ryan said nothing. I stood there for another second, listening to the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen and the distant sound of traffic outside. Then Vanessa laughed softly. I'm just saying, it doesn't make sense for one person to stay in a place that sighs forever. My fingers tightened around the bowl. The house. My house. The home my late husband and I had spent 37 years paying for, repairing, and filling with memories. I took a slow breath, straightened my shoulders, and walked back into the dining room as if I had heard nothing at all. Everything smells wonderful, Mom, Ryan said when he saw me. He smiled, but something about it felt rehearsed. Vanessa smiled too. Her smile was always perfect. Too perfect. The kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. Thank you for coming tonight, Loretta, she said sweetly. We know it's a long drive. It was only 20 miles from my house to theirs. 20 miles I had driven countless times to babysit, help with school projects, attend birthdays, and show up whenever my family needed me. I set the bowl on the table and took my seat. Across from me sat my granddaughter Emma, scrolling through her phone. She looked up briefly and smiled. At least her smile was real. The dinner continued. Ryan talked about work. Vanessa talked about a renovation project they wanted to start next spring. Emma barely spoke at all. I nodded when appropriate and smiled when expected. But my mind kept returning to those words. The sooner we get that house, the better. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe there was some explanation. Maybe Vanessa had been talking about something completely different. Yet the uneasy feeling stayed with me. It settled quietly in my chest like a stone. As the evening went on, I noticed things I might have ignored before. Every time I mentioned plans involving my home, Vanessa became unusually interested. When I talked about replacing the roof next summer, she immediately asked how much that would cost. When I mentioned reorganizing the garage, she wanted to know exactly how much storage space I had. Small questions. Innocent questions. At least that was how they sounded. Still, I found myself paying attention in a way I never had before. After dessert, Ryan walked me to my car. The autumn air was cool, carrying the scent of fallen leaves across the driveway. Drive safely, Mom, he said. Then he hugged me. It should have made me feel better. Instead, I found myself searching his face for answers, looking for the little boy I used to know. The boy who once cried when I left him at summer camp for 3 days. The boy who used to tell me everything. I couldn't find him. Good night, sweetheart, I said quietly. On the drive home, the highway stretched ahead beneath the glow of streetlights. I turned off the radio and sat alone with my thoughts. The farther I drove, the more uncomfortable I became. Not because of what Vanessa had said, because of what Ryan hadn't said. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I knew something had changed. I just didn't know how much. Standing in the darkness, looking at the house my husband and I had built together, I suddenly realized a possibility I had never allowed myself to consider before. Maybe the family I thought I had wasn't the family I actually had. And maybe tonight wasn't a family dinner at all. I did not sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Vanessa's voice again. The sooner we get that house, the better. By morning, the words had settled into my mind like an unwelcome guest. I made coffee and stood by the kitchen window, watching the sun rise over the backyard. The grass needed mowing. The flower beds needed attention. Ordinary things. Things that usually comforted me. But that morning, they felt different. As I looked around the property, I found myself remembering all the years that had gone into it. My husband, Frank, and I bought this place when Ryan was 6 years old. Back then, the house was small and needed work. We painted walls ourselves. We planted trees. We spent weekends repairing things because hiring contractors was a luxury we could not always afford. Every corner of that house held a memory. Every improvement came from years of effort and sacrifice. I carried my coffee into the living room and sat in Frank's old chair. The silence felt heavier than usual. Since his passing 3 years earlier, I had learned to live alone. I missed him every day, but I had built a routine. I volunteered at the library twice a week. I attended church on Sundays. I met friends for lunch once or twice a month. My life was quiet, but it was mine. Yet as I sat there, another memory surfaced. Last Christmas, Vanessa had organized a family trip to a mountain resort. I found out about it only after they returned. Ryan told me they assumed I would not want to travel in winter. At the time, I accepted the explanation. Now I remembered the photographs Emma had posted online. Everyone smiling by a fireplace. Everyone together. Everyone except me. Then another memory appeared. Emma's 17th birthday. The celebration had been held at a restaurant less than 10 miles from my house. I had not received an invitation until the morning after. Vanessa said there had been a misunderstanding with the guest list. I believed her. I always believed her. One memory after another began lining up in my mind. Small moments, small exclusions, small disappointments. Each one had seemed harmless by itself. Together, they painted a picture I did not want to see. Around noon, I opened a family photo album. Ryan as a little boy at the county fair. Ryan holding a fishing rod beside Frank. Ryan graduating from high school. For years, I had convinced myself that family bonds could survive anything. Distance, busy schedules, misunderstandings. Looking at those photographs, I realized something painful. Relationships do not disappear all at once. They fade gradually. One missed phone call. One forgotten invitation. One excuse at a time. That afternoon, Emma called. Her voice brightened my mood immediately. We talked about college applications and her part-time job. Before hanging up, she said something that stayed with me. "Grandma, I miss seeing you as much as I used to." I smiled, but my chest tightened. "I miss you too, sweetheart." After the call ended, I sat quietly for several minutes. Emma still cared. That much was clear, which meant the distance had not come from her. As evening approached, I walked through my house room by room. For the first time, I stopped asking whether I was imagining things. I stopped searching for innocent explanations. The signs had been there for years. I simply had not wanted to see them. And once I finally did, I could not look away. The following week passed quietly on the surface. I kept my routines. I visited the library. I watered my roses. I attended Sunday service. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, however, I had begun paying attention in a way I never had before. On Wednesday afternoon, Ryan called unexpectedly. That alone was unusual. For years, most conversations started with me reaching out first. "Hi, Mom," he said warmly. "Just checking in." We talked for a few minutes about the weather and a local road construction project. Then the conversation shifted. "Have you ever thought about downsizing?" he asked casually. I stared out the kitchen window at the oak tree Frank had planted nearly 20 years earlier. "Not really," I answered. "This house still works fine for me." There was a brief pause. A smaller place might be easier to manage someday. I could almost hear someone else listening nearby. Maybe Vanessa. Maybe not. "I manage just fine," I replied. Ryan quickly changed the subject. When the call ended, I remained at the kitchen table for several minutes. Years ago, I would have dismissed the conversation entirely. Now it felt different, too deliberate, too carefully placed. The next evening, I attended a community fundraiser at the church hall. I spent most of the event speaking with neighbors and longtime friends. Near the dessert table, I ran into a woman named Carol whose daughter happened to work at the same real estate office Vanessa had used several times. We exchanged small talk. Then Carol smiled and said something that made my stomach tighten. "I heard your family might be making some big property decisions soon." I blinked. "Property decisions? Maybe I misunderstood," she said. "Someone mentioned your son and daughter-in-law were asking questions about larger homes and future assets." She quickly changed the subject, unaware of the effect her words had on me. I smiled politely and continued the conversation, but my thoughts were elsewhere. Future assets. The phrase echoed in my mind during the drive home. Once inside the house, I pulled an old storage box from the hall closet. Inside were folders containing financial records Frank had carefully organized over the years. He had always been meticulous. Every investment statement, every insurance document, every property record, everything labeled and dated. I sat at the dining room table and began sorting through the files. At first, I was simply looking for reassurance, proof that I was being overly suspicious. Instead, I discovered something else. The total value of our assets was far greater than I had realized. Frank had managed several long-term investments that had performed well over the years. Combined with the house, retirement accounts, and savings, the estate represented far more than a single piece of property. For a long moment, I simply stared at the numbers. Then another realization settled over me. Maybe the house was never the real target. Maybe it was only the most visible piece of something much larger. I closed the folder and looked around the quiet room. The family photographs on the shelves seemed to watch me from every direction. Ryan's graduation picture, Emma's first day of kindergarten, decades of memories, decades of trust. I wanted to believe I was wrong. I wanted a simple explanation that would make everything feel normal again. But the pieces were beginning to fit together too neatly. And for the first time, I started to wonder whether someone had been counting on me never asking questions at all. 2 days later, the answer arrived from a place I never expected. I was leaving the grocery store with 2 bags in my cart when I heard someone call my name. Loretta? I turned and saw Judith Carter walking toward me. Judith and I had known each other for more than 20 years. We were never best friends, but we had attended the same church, volunteered at the same events, and shared enough conversations over the years to trust one another. She smiled when she reached me, but her expression quickly changed. "Do you have a few minutes?" she asked quietly. There was something unusual in her voice. We settled onto a bench outside the store. Cars moved through the parking lot. Shopping carts rattled across the pavement. For a moment, Judith seemed unsure how to begin. Then she took a breath. "I have been debating whether to tell you this." My stomach tightened. "Tell me what?" She looked down at her hands. "A few weeks ago, I attended a charity luncheon. Vanessa was there." I said nothing. Judith continued carefully. She was speaking with a group of women. They did not realize I was close enough to hear parts of the conversation. The world around me suddenly felt very distant. "What did she say?" Judith hesitated. She was talking about the future, about property, about family finances. I felt my pulse quicken, and Judith looked directly at me. She said everything would belong to them soon. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The sounds of the parking lot faded into the background. I stared across the rows of parked vehicles while her words settled into place beside everything else I had learned. Everything would belong to them soon. Not might, not someday, soon. The certainty of it disturbed me more than anything else. Judith reached over and gently touched my arm. I almost convinced myself I misunderstood. But after hearing some of the things people have been saying lately, I thought you deserved to know. I thanked her for her honesty. We spoke a little longer before parting ways. During the drive home, I replayed every word of the conversation. By the time I pulled into my driveway, one thing had become clear. This was no longer a collection of isolated incidents. Too many pieces were pointing in the same direction. That evening, I sat on the back porch with a glass of iced tea and watched the sun disappear behind the trees. Frank used to sit beside me in the evenings. We would talk about small things, weather forecasts, weekend plans, the neighbors, nothing important. Yet somehow those conversations had always made life feel steady. I found myself wishing he were there now. Not because he could solve the problem, because he always saw people clearly, better than I did. As darkness settled over the yard, another memory surfaced. About a year before he passed away, Frank had made an unusual comment. We had been reviewing financial paperwork together. Out of nowhere, he had said, "Never let anyone rush you into decisions about money or property, even family." At the time, I laughed. I thought he was simply being cautious. Now I wondered if he had noticed something I missed. Maybe he had seen small warning signs long before I did. Maybe he understood how easily trust could be mistaken for security. I remained outside until the stars appeared overhead. The air had grown cooler. The neighborhood was quiet. For the first time since all of this began, I no longer questioned my instincts. Judith had given me something I desperately needed. Confirmation. I was not imagining things. I was not becoming suspicious for no reason. Something was happening beneath the surface. Something far larger than a house. And now I knew I could no longer afford to ignore it. The next Monday morning, I made a decision I should have made weeks earlier. I called the attorney who had handled most of Frank's legal matters for nearly 20 years. His name was Michael Turner. After a brief conversation with his receptionist, I was given an appointment for Thursday afternoon. I did not tell Ryan. I did not tell anyone. Some conversations are better held quietly. The days leading up to the meeting felt strangely calm. For the first time since my suspicions began, I was no longer reacting emotionally. I was gathering information. There is a difference. One comes from fear. The other comes from clarity. On Thursday, I drove 30 miles into the city. Michael's office occupied the third floor of a brick building that had stood downtown for decades. The waiting room looked exactly as I remembered. Dark wood furniture, framed certificates, a grandfather clock ticking steadily in the corner. Some things remain unchanged even when everything else feels uncertain. Michael greeted me warmly. He had aged since I last saw him, but his eyes remained sharp. After a few minutes of polite conversation, he leaned forward in his chair. "What can I help you with, Loretta?" I explained everything. The comments, the conversations, the growing sense that certain people were paying very close attention to my assets. Michael listened without interrupting. When I finished, he folded his hands and sat quietly for several seconds. Then he opened a file cabinet behind his desk. He removed a folder and placed it on the desk between us. "Frank asked me to keep this," he said. My heart skipped slightly. "What is it?" Michael opened the folder. Inside were copies of estate planning documents I had not reviewed in years. As he carefully explained each section, a picture began to emerge. Frank had structured several protections into our estate plan. Certain assets could not simply be transferred through pressure or convenience. Some accounts contained specific instructions. Other holdings required independent review before major changes could occur. Frank had not been controlling. He had been careful, very careful. Michael turned another page. "Your husband believed strongly that financial decisions should always remain in your hands." I stared at the document. Frank's signature sat at the bottom of the page. Seeing it again stirred something deep inside me. Not sadness, reassurance. It felt as though a voice from the past was quietly reminding me that I was stronger than I remembered. Did he ever explain why he wanted these protections? I asked. Michael hesitated. He did not mention any particular individual, but he often said that people sometimes behave differently when significant assets are involved. I sat back in my chair. The room suddenly felt brighter. For weeks, I had felt as though I was walking through fog. Now the outline of the situation was becoming visible. Frank had anticipated possibilities I never considered. More importantly, he had taken steps to protect me from them. By the end of the meeting, I left with copies of documents and a clearer understanding of my position. Nothing had changed legally. Everything had changed emotionally. As I walked back to my car, I noticed something I had not felt in a long time. Confidence. Not anger. Not revenge. Confidence. On the drive home, I thought about Ryan and Vanessa. They believed they understood the situation. They believed they knew where everything was headed. But there was one thing they did not know. Frank had prepared for the future far more carefully than anyone realized. And for the first time since this entire situation began, I suspected that the biggest surprise was still waiting ahead. Something changed after my meeting with Michael. Not on the outside. From anyone else's perspective, I was the same woman I had been the week before. I still attended church. I still met friends for coffee. I still answered Ryan's phone calls with a calm voice. But internally, I had stopped being passive. I had stopped hoping the situation would somehow fix itself. Most importantly, I had stopped volunteering information. A few days later, Ryan called again. "How are things going, Mom?" he asked. "Just fine," I replied. "How is the house holding up?" The question came quickly. Too quickly. "The house is fine," I said. "Any new repairs coming up?" I smiled to myself. In the past, I would have given him a complete update. This time, I simply said, "Nothing important." A brief silence followed. Then he moved on to another topic. It was subtle, but I noticed it. The conversation ended sooner than usual. The following week, Vanessa invited me to lunch. That alone surprised me. Over the past few years, most invitations had come from Ryan. We met at a small cafe downtown. Vanessa arrived wearing her usual polished smile. She complimented my sweater, asked about my garden, ordered a salad. Everything seemed perfectly normal. Then the conversation drifted toward the future. "Have you ever considered moving closer to us?" she asked. I stirred my eyes. Not really. It would make things easier. Easier for whom? I wondered. "I like where I live." Her smile remained fixed. "You cannot stay in that big house forever." There it was again. The house. Always the house. I shrugged lightly. "I have managed this long." For a moment, something flickered across her face. Frustration. It disappeared almost immediately, replaced by another smile. But I saw it. Before, I would have missed it. Now I noticed everything. After lunch, I drove home feeling strangely calm. Months earlier, the conversation would have upset me. Now it simply confirmed what I already suspected. The more I stopped sharing information, the more interested they became. Meanwhile, I began organizing my own records. Every evening, I spent an hour reviewing documents, financial statements, property records, insurance information. Not because I feared losing control, because I intended to keep control. There is a difference. During that process, I also started writing notes, dates, conversations, comments people had made, small details that once seemed insignificant. Patterns began to emerge. The same subjects appeared repeatedly. My assets, my future plans, my home, my retirement accounts. One Friday evening, Emma stopped by unexpectedly after work. We sat on the back porch and talked for nearly an hour. She laughed about college applications and told stories about her friends. Before leaving, she hugged me tightly. "I miss spending time here," she said. "It always feels peaceful." After she drove away, I sat quietly in the fading sunlight. Emma's words stayed with me. Peaceful. That was exactly what I intended to protect. Not just the house, not just the finances. My peace, my independence, my ability to make my own decisions. For years, I had assumed everyone wanted what was best for me. Now I understood something important. Not everyone benefits when you remain strong. Some people benefit when you become dependent. As that realization settled in, I felt something unexpected. Not fear, not sadness, determination. And for the first time, I had the distinct feeling that Ryan and Vanessa were beginning to notice the difference. 3 weeks later, an invitation arrived in the mail. Vanessa was hosting a large family gathering at their house. According to the card, the event was meant to celebrate several milestones at once. Birthdays, career achievements, family accomplishments, the kind of occasion designed to bring everyone together. When I first read it, I smiled. Then I noticed something else. Vanessa had personally called several relatives to encourage attendance. Cousins from out of state were coming. Old family friends were expected. Nearly everyone would be there. The timing felt deliberate. I placed the invitation on the kitchen counter and stared at it for several minutes. Something told me this gathering was important. Not because of the celebration itself, because of what might happen there. Over the following days, I received several phone calls from relatives discussing travel plans and hotel reservations. Everyone sounded excited. Everyone except me. I was not nervous. I was observant. There is a difference. By now, I had spent weeks quietly gathering information. I had reviewed documents, organized records, spoken with Michael, written notes. Most importantly, I had stopped reacting emotionally. That change alone had altered everything. The more composed I became, the more curious Ryan and Vanessa seemed. A few days before the event, Ryan called again. "You are still coming on Saturday, right?" he asked. "Of course," I replied. His relief seemed immediate. "Good. Everyone is looking forward to seeing you." After we hung up, I sat quietly and thought about his words. Everyone. It was an interesting choice. The truth was that family gatherings used to make me genuinely happy. I loved hearing laughter in the backyard. I loved seeing children run across the lawn. I loved sharing meals around crowded tables. Those moments reminded me why Frank and I worked so hard all those years. We wanted a family that stayed connected, a family that looked after one another. Yet now, as the celebration approached, I found myself looking at things differently. Not with bitterness, with clarity. Saturday finally arrived. The morning was cool and bright. I took my time getting ready. I chose a navy blue dress and a simple pearl necklace Frank had given me years earlier. Nothing extravagant, just enough to remind myself who I was. When I arrived at Ryan's house, cars already lined both sides of the street. Music drifted from the backyard. People stood in small groups talking and laughing. Vanessa greeted guests near the entrance with her usual polished smile. The moment she saw me, she walked over quickly. "Loretta, you made it." Her voice sounded cheerful, almost too cheerful. I smiled politely. I would not miss a family gathering. For a brief second, something unreadable crossed her face. Then the smile returned. Throughout the afternoon, I moved from conversation to conversation. Cousins, neighbors, friends. Everyone seemed relaxed. Everyone seemed happy. Meanwhile, I watched. Not obviously, quietly. Ryan and Vanessa appeared unusually confident, almost celebratory. Several times, I noticed them exchanging private looks across the yard. The kind of looks people share when they believe everything is going according to plan. As the sun began lowering toward the horizon, folding tables filled with food and desserts. More guests arrived. The crowd grew larger. The atmosphere became increasingly festive. Standing near the patio, I looked around at the gathering. Nearly every important person in our extended family was present. And suddenly, I understood something. Whatever Ryan and Vanessa believed was about to happen, they expected witnesses. They expected an audience. The realization settled over me slowly. I sipped my iced tea and smiled to myself. Because while they believed this day marked the end of something, I had begun to suspect it was actually the beginning. As evening settled over the backyard, Vanessa stepped onto the patio and tapped a glass with a spoon. Conversations slowly faded. People turned toward her with smiles and polite attention. String lights glowed overhead. Children chased one another across the lawn. For anyone looking from the outside, it appeared to be a perfect family gathering. Vanessa thanked everyone for coming. She spoke about family, gratitude, and the importance of staying connected. Then she invited Ryan to stand beside her. The two of them exchanged a glance that immediately caught my attention. It was the same look I had noticed throughout the afternoon. Confidence, expectation. As Ryan began speaking, I realized they had planned this moment carefully. He thanked relatives for their support over the years. He talked about future goals and long-term plans. Then he shifted the conversation toward responsibility, toward aging, toward making wise decisions for the future. Several people nodded along. On the surface, everything sounded reasonable. Then Ryan looked directly at me. "Mom has worked hard her entire life," he said. "We all want what is best for her." A few people smiled in my direction. I smiled back, calmly, patiently. Ryan continued. "Sometimes accepting help can be difficult. Sometimes change is difficult. But families should make those transitions easier." The yard became noticeably quieter. I could feel dozens of eyes moving between us. Vanessa stepped forward. "We have all been talking about ways to support Loretta as she moves into the next chapter of her life." There it was. The audience. The witnesses. Exactly as I suspected. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Vanessa gently mentioned downsizing. She mentioned simplifying responsibilities. She mentioned making things easier in the years ahead. Every word sounded thoughtful. Every word sounded caring. Yet underneath the polished language sat a message that was impossible to miss. They wanted everyone to believe decisions had already been made. I looked around the yard. Relatives watched with uncertain expressions. Some appeared confused. Others appeared uncomfortable. Emma stood near the edge of the patio, her face tense. She clearly had no idea where this conversation was heading. I slowly placed my glass on the table beside me and stood. The movement alone seemed to surprise Ryan. "May I say something?" I asked. Nobody objected. The yard fell completely silent. "First," I said, smiling gently, "I appreciate everyone's concern." I paused, and I appreciate how much effort has gone into discussing my future. Several people exchanged glances. Ryan's smile began to weaken. I continued speaking calmly. "Fortunately, I have spent the last several weeks reviewing my plans very carefully." Vanessa's expression froze for a fraction of a second. "I have met with advisors, reviewed legal documents, organized financial records." Nobody interrupted. "And I am happy to report that everything is exactly where it should be." The silence deepened. Ryan shifted his weight slightly. Vanessa folded her arms. I reached into my handbag and removed a folder. Not dramatically, simply and calmly. "My late husband prepared extensively for the future," I said. "He made sure every decision would remain under my control for as long as I choose." Several relatives looked surprised. Others appeared relieved. I saw confusion spreading across Ryan's face. For the first time all evening, neither he nor Vanessa seemed certain about what would happen next. And at that moment, I realized something important. The story they expected to tell tonight was no longer theirs to tell. For several seconds after I finished speaking, nobody said a word. The evening air felt still. Even the laughter from the children playing farther across the yard seemed distant. Ryan stared at the folder in my hands. Vanessa maintained her smile, but it no longer looked effortless. It looked strained. I stood calmly beside the table and looked around at the faces of my family. Some appeared confused. Others appeared relieved. A few seemed to be seeing the situation clearly for the very first time. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse anyone. I simply continued. "Frank spent many years making sure our future would be secure," I said. "And I have spent the last several weeks making sure I understand every part of that plan." Ryan finally spoke. "Mom, nobody is questioning your ability to make decisions." His words sounded careful. Too careful. I nodded. I am glad to hear that. Another silence followed. Then something unexpected happened. Emma stepped forward. She looked from her parents to me. Grandma has always taken care of herself, she said quietly. She still does. Her words were simple, but they carried weight. Several relatives nodded in agreement. The atmosphere shifted. Not dramatically, gradually, like clouds moving away from the sun. The assumptions that had quietly filled the gathering all afternoon began to disappear. People started asking different questions. Questions about my volunteer work, my travel plans, my garden, my future. Not one person asked about selling the house. Not one person suggested that I could not manage my own affairs. Vanessa glanced around the group and seemed to realize the conversation was no longer going where she expected. Before long, guests returned to their meals and conversations. Music resumed. Laughter returned. The gathering continued. Yet something fundamental had changed. The narrative Ryan and Vanessa had carefully built no longer controlled the room. Later that evening, as people prepared to leave, Emma hugged me tightly. "I am proud of you," she whispered. I smiled and kissed her forehead. "Thank you, sweetheart." Ryan approached a few minutes later. For the first time all evening, he seemed uncertain. Older somehow. Less confident. "Can we talk sometime?" he asked. I looked at him for a moment. Not as an opponent. As my son. "Yes," I said. "We can talk." Because despite everything, I still loved him. Love and boundaries can exist together. That was a lesson I had learned far too late. The drive home felt different from every drive I had taken over the previous month. I was not replaying conversations. I was not searching for clues. I was not questioning myself. The uncertainty was gone. When I pulled into my driveway, the porch light cast a warm glow across the front yard. I sat in the car for a moment and looked at the house. The same house Frank and I built together. The same house that had witnessed birthdays, graduations, holidays, and countless ordinary moments. It no longer felt like something I needed to defend. It felt like home again. Over the months that followed, I made several changes. I updated documents, clarified responsibilities, established firm boundaries. Not because I wanted revenge, because clarity prevents confusion. Peace requires protection. Most importantly, I stopped measuring my worth by how useful I was to other people. I did not need anyone's permission to value my own life. Looking back now, I realized the greatest gift was not discovering who I could trust. It was discovering that I could trust myself. Sometimes people reveal their true intentions when they think you are too afraid to notice. Sometimes they underestimate your strength. And sometimes, when the masks finally come off, you do not lose your family. You simply gain a clearer view of who everyone truly is, including yourself.